Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today for Valentine's Day, I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite relationships in adult fantasy. Where I think adult fantasy really shines is its explorations of the other important relationships between characters. So that could be familial love in the form of siblings, a parent and a child, it could be a really deep friendship or some other sort of bond. But I have a ton of these really impactful relationships that have made me think about a certain book for a long period of time or has really made a book stand out for me. So I gathered a few of my favorite ones and I thought that that might be a nice topic to explore today on Valentine's Day. The first relationship that I want to explore is also the one that I have known the longest, and that is the friendship of Legolas and Gimli from The Lord of the Rings. So this is obviously a really popular relationship, especially since the advent of the movie franchise. So I think because the books and the movies have both been such a big part of my life for such a long time, it's hard to completely separate the characters from the two. But what I will talk about more today is the relationship that Legolas and Gimli have in the books rather than the films. For people who have read and watched both, who enjoy both, I think we can all agree that the way that these characters are portrayed and the way that their relationship builds is a little different in the books and in the movies. And it doesn't necessarily mean that either of these representations is better or worse. They just differ in a few key ways. The Legolas and Gimli from the movie franchise are clearly functioning as some of the comic relief for such a long and heavy movie franchise, and they do that really well. I think that their banter is really fun. They develop a strong friendship with that undercurrent of competitiveness between them, and it works really well, at least in my opinion, for the film franchise. But the Legolas and the Gimli that we see in Tolkien's books is a little different and a little more subtle than the relationship that builds in the movies. You know, for pacing reasons, the relationships between all the characters in the movie franchises kind of truck along because even though realistically the time span is still the same, we're watching things in real time. And so we get this sense of urgency from the films that we don't always get from the books themselves. What I love about the friendship in the books is how organically it comes about. Just for some context, in the books there is a strained relationship between the dwarves and the elves, and this is represented by a couple of clashes that Legolas and Gimli have as they set out as part of the Fellowship and as they make their way through Middle-earth toward their final destination. Their animosity is usually on a cultural level rather than a personal level. So it's not that Legolas and Gimli detest each other as people, it's more that there have been events throughout the history of their peoples that have made them wary or distrustful of one another. And one character who really helps the relationship come into fruition is Gandalf, who actually requests of them at one point to kind of put aside any petty ideas of who they might have been to each other had they not been in this circumstance, and recognize that he needs them, Frodo needs them, everyone in the company needs them to try to get along and to be friends. And you can see as they make their way through Moria, as they head into the forests together, that you can see that their relationship slowly starts to build. They encounter difficult situations that they need to face as a team. They begin to see that they share some of the same hopes and some of the same fears for Middle-earth, and it starts to bring them closer together. You do get some funny moments, because you get some funny moments from everybody in the books, but it's not the same kind of banter and the same kind of joking / competitive relationship that we see develop between them in the films. If you enjoy the relationship of Legolas and Gimli, and you like seeing how they grow to depend on one another, to trust one another's assessments of what's happening, to believe in each other, then if you read into the appendices and you read into the extended universe, then you know that this relationship continues on long after the Fellowship has disbanded, and that Gimli and Legolas are able to do things and to impact each other's lives in ways that have not been seen before in Middle-earth. It feels strange to kind of spoiler guard information about Legolas and Gimli, you know, information for a series that is so well known and so beloved. But I think if you haven't read the books and you want to give them a try, that there are things that you should discover on your own and that you may not know. And that's part of the joy of reading books after you see a film that you have loved so much. So that is all I will say, but Gimli and Legolas were definitely one of my first favorite friendships in fantasy. I enjoy that their relationship is built from mutual respect, that they begin to see the merits that they each have as individuals, and that it grows into such a pure and loyal relationship. It is definitely one of the best, and even though Sam and Frodo are the easy choice to make for The Lord of the Rings, I definitely felt the impact of Legolas's and Gimli's relationship more strongly than I did for Frodo and Sam. To shift focus a little bit, I want to talk about a couple of familial relationships that I really, really enjoy. So the first two characters that I want to talk about are not actually related by blood, but develop a really deep bond that serves essentially as parent and child. And those would be Burrich and Fitz from Assassin's Apprentice, or from the Farseer trilogy in general. Again, I feel like to fully explore some of these relationships, you would need to get into deep spoilers. So I'll try to just capture the essence of what I love about this relationship without actually getting into spoiler territory. From the setup of Assassin's Apprentice, Fitz is a young boy who is found to be the bastard son of the prince of his kingdom, whose name is Chivalry. And so when Fitz's identity is discovered and it is known that Chivalry sired a bastard son, he steps down as heir apparent and leaves the kingdom, leaving Fitz as this identified potential royal who no longer has the support of his royal father, who is kind of thrust into court politics that he doesn't understand and into danger that he doesn't really fathom. He's taken away from his family and placed in this really frightening and strange world, and the person who is assigned to take care of him is Chivalry's stable master and man-at-arms, Burrich. And this creates a really complicated dynamic between Burrich and Fitz. So Burrich, as we begin to find out as the series progresses, had a fierce loyalty to Chivalry. And the reasons for that do become clear over the trilogy. You get more background into each of the characters in the series. This is a highly character-focused trilogy, and you do get a lot of that really rich background. But as we kind of go through the story, it is in the perspective of Fitz, who starts off as a really young child. And so everything that we know as the readers is skewed by his perception of his life, of his world, of his relationships with other people. So Burrich comes in as this caretaker, and he takes Fitz under his wing and makes him basically a stable hand, someone to help him out in the stables, teaches him everything that he knows, and tries his best to be a father figure. As a soldier, as someone who likes to drink a lot, as someone who didn't have a lot of close relationships outside of Fitz's father, Burrich's relationship with Fitz is complicated by a lot of different dynamics. There is care because he is the son of a man that he admired so much. There is resentment because Burrich's life and the life of the person that he had so much respect for changed so much when Fitz came onto the scene. There's loneliness, there's a sense of duty, and amongst all this, we have the interpretations of a small boy who doesn't really understand those complicated adult feelings, and so who interprets things as animosity, as a lack of caring, and it's so frustrating to read because you can see from the interactions that they have that even when Burrich is being harsh it clearly comes from a place of caring from someone who maybe didn't ever intend to be a parent himself, who had no experience and then is one day just made the caretaker of this really complex little boy whose place in the kingdom is so nebulous and so impactful. And it is really, really satisfying to watch their relationship change and grow over the course of the trilogy. This relationship is often rocky, as relationship with parents often are. This relationship can be tender, it can be sweet, it can be horrifying. And I think for people who are parents, you can definitely see things that you can identify with, the frustrations, that disconnect that comes between being a parent and being the child, that struggle of will, that Birch often wants the best for Fitz and feels that he knows what that is. Fitz wants to be his own person and feels that Birch doesn't understand. And the way that Robin Hobb creates these relationships is unlike any other author that I have ever read. She has insight into the human condition, insight into the way that people interact, into the way that relationships are formed, that is unparalleled. And if you love to read about complex relationships that don't, that aren't simplified, that aren't like, this parents love their children and everything is great and happy 100% of the time and there's no complicating factors because love conquers all. Like if you want a real gritty portrayal of complex human relationships, then I think Robin Hobb is the master of that. There are other really impactful relationships in the Farseer trilogy, but the interactions and the growth between Fitz and Birch is one of the ones that had the most impact on me as I read. But it's also one of the easier ones to explore without spoilers and without giving too much away. So I think it is a perfect one to talk about. The next relationship is an actual parental relationship, and that is between Misaki and Mamoru from The Sword of Kaigen. So The Sword of Kaigen is also a very recently published novel, self-published, that had a ton of buzz on BookTube over the past year. I read it in December, I think, of 2020 and absolutely loved it. I know there are people who have liked parts of it and not others. It is a book that shifts in tone and in exploration of themes, so I can see how people would like certain parts over others and how people could be really split, how this could be kind of a polarizing novel. But I will say that I loved all of it. I loved the parts that were more thoughtful, more character focused, and then I loved the parts that were more action focused. But essentially what this novel is that it focuses on a family that lives on a section of a peninsula, basically, that is called the Sword of Kaigen, and it is isolated from the rest of the country. And living on this small peninsula are a bunch of families that have harnessed the powers of what is essentially a warrior race and are thought of as the first line of defense against any invading powers. And the two main characters that we follow are Misaki, who is the wife of one of the major lords in this realm, and her 14-year-old son, Mamoru. And what we see between these two characters is, again, a really complicated and complex parent-child relationship. Mamoru is Misaki's oldest child. She has, I think it's 4 children, but it's been a couple of months, and I don't remember that exact detail, but she has, I think, 4 kids, and he is the oldest of all of them. He's 14, and he is well on his way to becoming a respected warrior. Each of the families has various powers that they can try to manifest, and what his family is known for is something called the Whispering Blade. So it's essentially creating a sword or a blade out of pure ice. They can harness elemental magic, and this family is really well known for this very difficult and powerful technique. And when we enter the story, Mamoru is trying to develop these skills and feeling like he is overshadowed by his father and his various ancestors. And his mother, we see, is a woman who seems caught up in circumstances that she can't control. Again, I don't want to go into spoilers, but what I can say is that Misaki is a character who is very much more than she initially appears, someone who has a power and a backstory that is all her own, and that potentially doesn't fit into this village that has very traditional values and very specific thoughts about what women should or shouldn't do. Over the course of the introduction to this story, we find that Misaki is trapped in what seems to be a very loveless marriage and has a very complicated relationship to her children and with her identity as a mother. I don't want to talk about specifics, but I will say that this novel explores the impact of postpartum depression, of forced motherhood, of that inability to bond immediately with your children, and what that means in a society where being a mother is all your identity is as a woman. It explores topics of motherhood that aren't often looked at in literature, let alone fantasy, and it highlights the relationship between these two characters, which is so beautiful and so heartbreaking. This book explores grief, it explores missed opportunities, and the relationship between Misaki and her son is unlike any other mother-son relationship that I have read in fantasy, and it is very much worth exploring. Their relationship and Misaki's journey, I guess you call it, her journey through motherhood, is part of what made this book so interesting to me, and I think that's why I enjoyed every part. You know, I enjoyed those thoughtful character explorations just as much as I enjoyed the action that comes later in the story. But this is definitely one of the best relationships that I have read in the last couple of years. It is something that made this story stick with me, and is something that will keep the character of Misaki especially in my mind for a long time, I am sure. So finally, to wrap up this video, the last relationship that I want to talk about is actually a group dynamic as opposed to a relationship between two separate characters. And that would be Roland's quartet, or his group of comrades in the Dark Tower series. Roland is a gunslinger, and the Dark Tower series is kind of Stephen King's magnum opus. It is the series that connects out into his extended multiverse and is the backbone, I think, of his life's work. It is by far and away my favorite work by Stephen King. It is one of my favorite series of all time. And so I understand that there is a high degree of bias here, but I truly think that for all of the criticisms that people seem to throw at Stephen King, I don't know how anyone could ever make the assertion that he does not create astounding characters. He puts an incredible amount of care into the characters that he constructs, and that makes you attached to them. And when you're following them over a series of 7 books, you become unbelievably attached to these characters. And the relationships that build between the members of this company, which include Roland, who is a gunslinger, Eddie, who is, when he comes into the story, a heroin addict, and all around kind of miscreant. We have Jake, who is a young boy who comes from Earth and has a complicated relationship with Roland himself. We have Susanna, who is a Black woman from the United States, whose personality in our world and whose personality in Roland's world have some shifting dynamics, and that is all I will say about that. And then we also have a character who comes in later in the series but is just as dear, and that is Oi, who is a billy bumbler, which is an animal species made up by Stephen King, but kind of resembles a tanuki from, you know, if you were gonna contrast it to a real world animal, kind of a raccoon, dog, bear kind of animal that has a limited capacity for speech and can understand humans, and becomes really intensely bonded with Jake, and also shares a relationship with the rest of the members of the team. What I love about this group of people is that they are all considerably flawed. They all have different strengths that they bring to the group, and because of the way that they are connected to each other, there is a frisson of, you know, there is an idea that fate is propelling some of the activities or some of the happenings in the Dark Tower along a certain path, and the way that each of these characters and the way that their personalities influence how they feel about the quest overall, how they interact with each other, is really, really interesting. Without trust and without the development of these strong relationships, the individual members of this group wouldn't get very far. They all have to lean on each other at certain parts over the series. They all make mistakes. There are conflicts that arise in the group. There are things that are easily solved. There are things that are complicated. They're shifting dynamics, and all in all, it is just a really realistic portrayal of a group of, I don't even know if you call them friends all the time, but I will call them friends for the purpose of this video, but a group of friends, or a group of people who are bound so intensely to each other. I guess in the terms that people like to use now, I would call this probably like a found family dynamic. And in terms of that kind of group dynamic, this is, and I am going to go out on a limb and say it will probably always be my favorite grouping of that type. The way that King writes his characters, the way that he explores their relationships is fantastic. I think it is one of his biggest strengths as an author, and I am of the opinion that he has many strengths because I really like Stephen King. He's one of my favorites, and it just makes these books all the more enjoyable. The relationship between them is one of the defining characteristics of the series, and if you are going to pick it up for no other reason than that, I think that it makes it worthwhile. It is a group of individuals who mean a lot to me and who I think are more as a group than their individual parts. They make up something bigger together. And that is one of the themes that's explored in these books, is the power of these relationships, of friendships, of your own personal ambition versus your care for other people. Those are things that are explored extensively in these pages. And you know, the characters don't always get it right, but we see them try. We see them succeed and we see them fail. And I love the characters for that. We spend so much time thinking about superficial romantic love. I read so many books that feel great to read in the moment because they're angsty and they're intense and they propel the action along so quickly. But it is so much more satisfying to find relationships like the ones that I have outlined in this video that are impactful, that are complex, that are not always easy. A lot of them are really difficult. A lot of these characters do things to each other that seem unforgivable, that are not understood in the moment, that have impacts that reverberate over the course of the entire series. And those are all reasons that I think that they are so memorable and so important. I am a super character-focused reader. I care about characters and their relationships with each other over anything else when I'm reading. I love hearing about the relationships that other people have found interesting in fantasy, and I would love to know if you agree or disagree about any of the ones that I have highlighted today, or what your most important relationships in fantasy might be, the relationships that you have enjoyed the most, that have changed a book for you, or that have made a book one of your favorites. I want to hear about it all, would love to hear from any of you, and thanks so much for watching. Bye!